So hello, everyone. My name is Laurent Carbonneau. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Council of Canadian Innovators, which is a business council made up of the CEOs of 150, give or take, of Canada's fastest growing companies in technology, I should add. And with me today, I'll let my panelists introduce themselves.
Dan Herman, CEO of Intellectual Property Ontario.
Emily Boutros, Managing Partner at Tandem Launch.
Excellent. So great to have you both on. So Benjamin Franklin once famously observed that there were just two things that were certain in life, which is to say death and taxes. I will leave death to a different room, but here we are to talk about taxes. And I think had he lived another 50 odd years, he probably would have added government attempts to engineer the economy in various ways after Alexander Hamilton built a lot of canals. So with all of that, I think, this is a room full of innovators in various guises, and I think there's a lot of interest on the part of government to sort of play in the innovation economy and figure out ways that they can boost innovation. And a lot of ways that they do that is through the tax system, but not exclusively through the tax system. So to begin with, I'll throw to Dan first to talk a little bit about kind of a short history of how the government here has kind of played in this space with kind of a lens on the tax stuff in particular.
Sure, and it comes with a caveat. I'm a reformed federal civil servant who worked on these files. I now work for the Government of Ontario agency that gives support to entrepreneurs and SMEs. So if you're an investor and you have a portfolio of companies, or you're a company who needs IP support to build a strategy, to get patents, come talk to me afterwards. That's what we're here for. But when you look at, I won't give a history necessarily, but when you look at the big picture of our economy, and you look at our support for business innovation, the biggest chunk is a program called SR&ED. If we say that's about $4 billion worth of funding that goes to 20-odd thousand companies. Everything else looks pretty small in comparison. When I was down the street here, we worked on billion-dollar programs, but they're $1 billion over multiple years. The big chunk of peanut butter, because in Canada we always talk about, we spread the peanut butter really thin on all our innovation support programs with a land of 1,000 or 1,000,000 stranded pilot projects. SR&ED is the one predictable source of cash for our entrepreneurs and for our SMEs. And that is theoretically a great thing. The problem is, and Claudia this morning, who started the conference talking about, we're a community of great entrepreneurs, great startup ecosystems, but we do have a problem that we need to acknowledge, which is, a productivity rate that for 20-odd years has been diverging from the United States and our other peers pretty dramatically. So as great as it is, there is a problem in the state of Denmark, and just now we call it Canada. And if our biggest pile of cash for innovation support isn't leading to the ultimate outcomes that we need, which is companies that grow, that create prosperous employees who invest, et cetera, then we should be looking and saying, what's wrong with this? So over the course of the past, call it 10 years, there have been multiple kind of window openings on, hey, let's review SR&ED because fundamentally it's the biggest pile of cash. And every time they've done it until recently, the door has somehow closed without any results coming from that. And that's ultimately the big P and the little p of politics, that because of the predictability of this fund, it's really popular. And so any changes, depending on the sector that would be affected, depending on the type of firm, the stage of firm, it gets really complicated. And so the last two announcements on a review of SR&ED have somehow never been published. And if you go down to 90 Elgin, they'll tell you the stories of why. Now we're finally at a stage where there does seem to be a real review of the process. If anything, it's been extended to get more feedback in. And I think this is really positive, because for that $4 billion worth of spend, which, as I noted, dwarfs everything else, we need to figure out how to create growth out of this. We need to figure out how do we help the companies who do have the potential to become the next X's, and who forget about what the X is, to become high growth companies, right? Like, if I'm a super wonk on this stuff, and but it's, if there are 5% of all companies that lead to 80% of net new job growth, that's what we need to spend a little bit more time and effort figuring out how to channel. And it's not about picking winners, it's actually about following people who are better at picking winners, many of whom are in this room. So that's maybe the 10,000-foot view, but I think my colleague actually has a far closer to ground level view on it.
Yeah, so tax credits, first of all, my name is Emily Tandem Launch is a startup foundry in Montreal. We build startups in deep technology, more than 35, and I've been doing this for more than a decade, so I have a lot of experience with startups. And the SR&ED program is awesome for startups. It's actually the biggest source of non-dilutive funding for a lot of entrepreneurs and very central in any technology startup or entrepreneur's like budget that you're going to put together. The challenge that we have, especially in deep technology, is you do have to invest massively in innovation and research and development, but the tough part is actually the commercialization. And right now, the whole envelope is, well, everybody will get a stake at it, and we'll let the market decide on who's going to commercialize the innovation. And the people that are in charge of commercializations is the VC industry, the BDC, and the angels, like the private investors. I think it would be beneficial if a part of the envelope that's allocated for innovation and research was shifted a little bit towards the commercialization, so everybody at least gets a kick at the can. When you're working and trying to commercialize deep technologies, it's expensive. It requires a large amount of capital. The VC industry, the people that are leading the VC industry or the institutionals, most of them don't have the technical background to evaluate the quality of the technology. So they're going to want to have some kind of traction. The problem is it takes years before you can get the traction, and then it's a chicken and egg problem. You can't raise money because you don't have the traction. To get the traction, you need to raise money. The angels are great, by the way. I know this is NACO, but they're a great source of funding. They're, for Tandem Launch, I mean, we raised more than 300 million in third-party financings. We have 3 funds. They're the largest source of funding for us, like the private investors. The problem is that the amounts are not big enough. Like, you kind of need to have a big check somewhere along the way. So if it was like matching private investments, or I'm not sure how they want to structure like the program, but they would take part of that envelope that's strictly dedicated to pure innovation and transfer it to commercialization, either a matching fund or a tax credit, or the structure would be. I think it would be helpful to have more startups that can commercialize the technology and generate growth in Canada. The second problem that I see with the tax credits from an entrepreneur point of view is it's a program that you kind of need to incur the expenses for a year, and then you fill up the form, and then it takes a few months to get the cash back. And because of this, liquidity is kind of key in a startup. There's a whole side industry of consultants and finance like people that are financing the tax credits. So basically, if you're an entrepreneur, you can get the tax credits, but you also have to pay the interest because the government doesn't pay you quick enough and get it financed by either party or even the government itself is financing it. It would be helpful if there was some kind of way that the government could figure out a way to disperse the cash a bit quicker to help the entrepreneurs and the liquidity aspect of building a startup.
Yeah, so that's great. So I think what I've heard here is that there's kind of 2 issues here, which is where the money goes and how it gets there, which is to say, to distill that down to a couple of words, it's policy and plumbing.
Can I add, there's a third issue though, and I think Emily did a good job of outlining. It's you know, it's also what it's for.
Yeah.
Right? Because the R&D that we've conceptualized for the past 74 years under SR&ED's existence, as Emily notes, we live in a different economy. The companies that we're building are quite different. You know, if in a 40-year span we've gone from public markets being 10% intangibles to 90% intangibles, what we're building and how we're building them have changed dramatically. So 3 issues.
No, absolutely. So that's a good point, and I think that kind of definition of R&D piece is something that the government is looking at. And I'll just go to the room here for a second. How many folks here have interacted with the SR&ED system kind of in some way? Pretty much everybody. Okay, that's sort of what I thought. How many of you guys found that experience to be, A+, very smooth? Not as many. Okay, that's kind of what I thought as well. So to that point, the government is doing this big review of SR&ED right now, and they've done the round 1 of consultations wrapped up, I don't know, about a month ago, and are now doing a round 2 that is very accelerated. And one of the options that was kind of floated in there was a patent box, which is to say a kind of an incentive based on income related to IP and other assets that are generated through research. So I'm curious what you guys make of the idea that that's a good way to kind of get about supporting activities indirectly that are, that commercialization piece rather than just the pure research. Go ahead, Dan. Yeah.
I work for an IP agency. I've looked at patent boxes for about 15 years now. The evidence on their utility and on their ability to change the behavior of firms to create more, to develop more IP is quite weak. That said, it seems that there's a zeitgeist that maybe we're going to move in this direction. I think there's a way to create one that allows for firms to be incentivized to develop. Because fundamentally, if we're an economy where to sell and win global markets, you need to have at minimum an IP strategy. You need to know what your freedom to operate is. Well, we need to arm firms with that very early. A patent box on its own is not doing that. A patent box in the life sciences, fantastic. You can draw a straight line from the patent to the revenue earned. It makes sense. A patent box on anything you have, any technological device that's either implanted in your knee or your heart or on your desks, the ability to equate value is very difficult, and the industry of consultants that exists around SR&ED would only multiply if all of a sudden we ask them just to try to figure out, okay, what value comes from the patent that I've input of the 59,000 patents that are in that device. So I question it, but I think there's a way to do it in certain industries. But I think the more important part is, how do you arm companies? How do you arm entrepreneurs? How do you help researchers who are moving from lab to market? How do you support them in the development of either a portfolio or just a strategy so that they know where they're going and that at some point they'll be able to take advantage of this? Because if not, it becomes a mechanism for, it's a tax scheme as opposed to a growth strategy.
Okay, so I live in a world of patents, but I do sit on a lot of boards, and there are some entrepreneurs that don't feel that patents come with income, especially in the software industry. Mm-hmm. There's a big debate about whether you have to file patents or not. There's also, it takes time. I'm not sure how they can link it to SR&ED, because before you know if you're going to get the application, and it's going to take like a few months, a few years before it gets granted. So I do believe that the number of patents is a KPI, but shouldn't be the one that decides how much money. I don't see it. How much money a startup should be eligible on. It will overcomplicate things. Like, it's already complicated enough. I don't see how you can simplify the way that you claim your SR&ED by adding the perspective of having to file IPs. And yep.
So that's a little bit on the policy side. On the plumbing side, which I think is a piece where, you mentioned earlier just the mechanics of getting money to companies sooner. Something we heard a lot from CCI member companies when we were doing consultations on this was looking at a system where you're sort of pre-distributing this, like you're doing your application, and then you're sort of doing this in disbursements kind of over the year and a half versus after. Yeah. I'm curious what you guys make of that, and whether that would be kind of helpful in your worlds.
Well, for sure, because right now you have to file the tax credits, file to get the financing with a third party, get the financing, and get the claim back. So for sure, it's very complicated. If we could only, like, as a start, if a startup only has to work with one institution, which would be the government, to file and get the cash, I mean, it already simplifies the process a lot. And for sure, from a cash, you can only finance 75% or 85% of your tax credits. So to be able to have access to it quicker, faster, and in the bank, I mean, managing the cash flow is kind of a key element when you're building a company. It's actually, like, I would like to talk, I forgot to say it, but the tax credits, like, Canada should keep that program because it attracts a lot of foreign investments. Like at Tandem Launch, like, we're building all the companies in Montreal, but sometimes we're recruiting CEOs, and a lot of them are from, well, a lot of them, we're trying to recruit in Canada, but sometimes we have to recruit in the States, and they have the choice to move the company in the States. And because of the tax credits, everybody stays in Canada. Nobody wants to let go of the tax credits. It helps the companies, the technologies companies, to keep the head office in Canada, it also attracts a lot of VC money from this. I'm on a lot of boards with US VCs that are completely impressed and blown away by the program that we have. And it's an incentive for them to invest in Quebec, in Canadian like startups, the fact that we are eligible for the tax credit. So I'm okay with the way that they want to restructure how they're going to allocate the envelope, but I do believe that the envelope is good for innovation, good for entrepreneurship, and good for Canada.
Dan, anything on your end?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that, except, cash flow is what matters when you're an entrepreneur. And, when Friday or Thursday or Wednesday rolls around and BDO asks you how much money's in the bank to make payroll, that's not a fun period. And so, unfortunately, most of our government programs don't start with that in mind, and they don't start with kind of with empathy as to what it is to miss payroll, and it's a shitty feeling. So, I think part of the plumbing is actually how do we design programs, and with whom do we design them with in mind? If we design government programs and support for business innovation with, the auditor in mind, which many of our programs are designed that way, well, then we get an output that is aligned to that, which doesn't necessarily fit for actually the needs of a company that needs to move exceptionally fast. And, call it 10 years ago, I think we were in a position where we saw broadly our place in the global innovation economy with much more optimism. And so I think you could buy, and I say this, even when I was down the street, right? There's used to write speeches for the minister about how great things were. And, but that zeitgeist, that's changed. And I think we need to change our approach to how do we support companies if we want to be in a fundamentally different spot 10 years from now or 20 years from now.
Yeah. So that's, I think, mentioning the kind of vibe in the room right now around the innovation economy, I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention it at all. I'm sure there are folks in the room once again with some thoughts on this. The announced capital gains inclusion rate changes in the budget. And I'm curious what you guys make of, how does this interact with kind of everything else that, governments, not just the federal government, but around the country are kind of trying to do in the innovation economy, and whether, what do you think the impact might be?
I don't want to touch that one too much. I'd like to walk away calmly. But what I'll say is, we need a strategy. When you treat tax policy over here, and you do procurement policy over here, and you get a funding envelope for this over here and for this over here, well, that's not a strategy. And I think actually part of the reason we're where we are is we've now shifted to discrete little programs as opposed to thinking through what's the future look like? What's the 10-year outlook like? And how do we get there with all of these levers, right? Because ultimately, these are all levers in a plan, and we should actually be figuring out, when we move this one, well, what do we need to do to counteract that? When you just do the one lever, and if you want to talk about that one, well, you get what you get. And it's actually, I can't quite figure out that there's not comms people who kind of saw that one coming. But it is, all these levers need to move in tandem, but that's a strategy, and that seems to be a bit of a challenge these days.
Okay, so as I said, at Tandem Launch, the angel investors are one of the largest source of funding for the fund and also for the startups. It's extremely difficult to get private investors to invest in startups in Canada. I've been doing it for more than a decade. I do believe that the government has to find some kind of incentive to encourage the angels and the private investors to invest in startups or funds that are there and that are focused on innovation and commercialization technology transfer from universities. But we do have a budget problem, so maybe the solution would be to segment the capital gain. So how would you treat the capital gain depending on the level of risk that people are taking? So, I do understand that somebody needs to pay taxes, but at a certain point, there's a way of doing it so that you segment it depending on the level of years or the number of years that you've been holding your investment, so that it makes sense for everybody and it has a positive impact on the overall innovation ecosystem.
Yeah. So Dan, you touched on kind of the need for a broader strategy, and I think maybe people are feeling that that's kind of what's missing right now. So what are the conversations on innovation policy, at a slightly more granular level that aren't happening right now that you really think should be? And either of you can take that one to start.
I think actually, and Emily brought one up, and it still kind of puzzles me that there's not more talk about the early stage financing gap that's present in this country. That, and maybe I'll point, not to be immodest, but when I joined the government in 2016, I'd worked for a research company before that had actually spent all of our time advocating for the late stage gap. We said, look, we've got this exceptional ecosystem, companies that are growing rapidly, but the only source of capital they can get for a B or C is in the United States. And so this is part of where the Venture Capital Catalyst Initiative came from, of like, we need late stage capital. But then everyone moved there. And everyone said, hey, we want to play that game because you're closer to an exit. Totally makes sense. But as everyone moved there and decided to go that party, the room over here got empty. And so, choose a year between 2015 and 2018, that early stage room got really empty. And so everyone who's looking for a dance partner over there, geez.
Struggling.
Yeah, like that's a lonely place to be. And somehow, and this isn't new, like this data has existed for a while, but the room remains, there's been no incentive. And if I borrow Emily's last point, like there's been no incentive really positioned for that early stage room to say, actually, we need to fill this full of people. And it's not a today, right? But this is about what happens 10 years from now, right? Because that stage isn't this fast. This is whatever, you all know this better than me, but if we're talking 8 to 10 years, we need to have been doing this 10 years ago in order to get something out the door tomorrow. And this is, you look at the rates of entrepreneurship, you look at economic dynamism, all these statistics that measure kind of the input side of the funnel of what we hope will become high growth companies. We're struggling on that. And I think it's in part because we haven't fed that early part of the system. In some places, and I'll say this quietly, hopefully this is all Chatham House rules, but like look at a university-based entrepreneurship. That system has been whittled down, at least in certain provinces. That's a problem, right? Because that is actually part of that pipeline that we depend on to create outputs 8 to 10 years from now.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I believe we are going to wrap up panel number 1 and bring on our deep tech, hard tech folks to talk exactly about the fun of the very early stage technology wise. So thank you to Emily and to Dan. Can we get a round of applause for these great folks?